Right. I believe we're live now. So I just want to say hello to everyone. I'm delighted to welcome you all to the second webinar of 2024 in the Sustainable Action Dialogue series. My name is Alex and I'm Head of Operations here at the Institute of Sustainability Studies. The purpose of hosting these webinars is to eliminate the frequently confusing terminology often associated with sustainability topics and to enable conversations on content that can assist businesses and individuals in reaffirming their commitment to tangible actions. Today's webinar is being presented by the wonderful Ian Long and is titled Green Print for Success, Unveiling the Power of Strategic Green Business Planning. So without further ado, I will pass you on to Ian and you can kick off today's webinar.
Great, thanks Alex, and thanks for everyone at the Institute for arranging today's session. I'm not sure about wonderful, but I'll take whatever compliment is coming my way. So thanks very much for that, and thanks for your help and everyone there in organising this. Hi everyone, you're very welcome, and thanks for attending, taking the time out from busy schedules to attend this session. So thank you for that. Just a brief word about myself before we get into this. We only have, I think it's about 40 minutes, and we'll allow time for a bit of Q&A at the end. So just briefly about myself, my name is Ian Long. I practice as a solicitor with Beecham's LLP, a commercial law firm here in Dublin. I specialise in the whole area of risk management, including things like regulatory compliance, GDPR, anti-money laundering, and more recently, the subject we want to talk about today, which is to do with ESG, sustainability, planning and reporting. It's become a huge issue, in not just from a compliance and reporting point of view, but kind of more importantly and more fundamentally from a good corporate citizenship point of view, in terms of what's happening to the planet and therefore what's happening to business. And therefore, today's session is really timely, and I'm so glad that so many of you have taken the time to do this. So that's a little bit about myself. So before we get into this, I just want to say a couple of things. First of all, I'll just share my screen, and hopefully everyone will be able to see my screen. Can everyone? I don't know, Alex. Can you confirm, or can?
See it anyway, so hopefully everyone else can.
Great. Thanks, Alex. So that's great. So again, bearing in mind the time constraints, just want to go straight into this to make sure we're all on the same page and we're all very clear as to the reasons why we're here. When we think of the word, when we say green, we obviously think of the environment, we think of the physical environment, we think of the natural world. But of course, in a wider sense, we're talking about sustainability. We're talking about planning, and which is the focus of this session today. But we're also talking about reporting. And the reason why I talk about reporting in connection with planning is because they feed off one another. You can't report on what you haven't planned or what you haven't measured. So when we talk about a plan, which is what we're going to focus on today in terms of a structure of the plan, the key elements of a plan, that feeds into, in turn, what we need to report on. Now, we'll be looking at reporting a little later on in this session, and some of the specific legal and compliance reporting requirements may not apply to you, may not apply to your business or your operation, but at the same time, even if they don't apply to your business or your operation, the key elements of the plan will feed into what you may need to report on to maybe a key supplier in your value chain, maybe to a key customer, maybe to a regulator if you're operating in a regulated industry like banking or insurance or some other regulated industry. So planning and reporting are kind of two sides of the same coin. And while we're going to focus most of today's session on planning, it feeds into reporting, which is absolutely key, because it's one of the essential outcomes of what we're going to talk about today, which is about how do we plan a strategy for being a green business, bearing in mind green, not just in the narrow sense of the physical environment, the natural world, but as I said earlier, bearing in mind that green also must be seen in a wider context of sustainability. So what do we mean by sustainability? So that's where we're coming from in this session. So I hope you find this informative and useful. Okay. So if we look at, first of all, if we define our terms and we look at, before we get to our terms, I'm jumping ahead of myself. Let's look briefly at the agenda for today. First of all, like I said, we're going to look at key definitions. What do we mean by ESG? What do we mean by sustainability, including all of the various green elements we're going to touch on? Secondly, what kind of sustainability plan? What are the essentials of a sustainability plan? Primarily in terms of two things: structure and the key elements of the plan to make sure that we, if you like, tick all the boxes. But all of that comes from the structure of the plan. You know, what's the context, the strategy, objectives, definitions, methodology, risks and controls. Sometimes we tend to forget that sustainability is part of risk management. I mean, we do risk management in our business anyway, don't we? We look at risks and controls. What are the key risks affecting the business? What are controls have we in place to mitigate against those risks? How effective are they? You know, what methodology did we use to identify them? And then finally, we're going to look at audit and assurance in terms of the data quality and in terms of how are we performing against our plan. So we'll be talking about all of those in section 2 on the agenda today in terms of the plan, the essentials of a robust, comprehensive sustainability plan. Okay. Thirdly, we're going to look at, like I said earlier, we're going to talk about compliance and reporting under similar headings. There are various EU global reporting frameworks out there. We'll talk a little bit about those. We're going to talk about reporting standards. We're going to talk about a thing called taxonomy or classification, as it's sometimes more commonly referred to. And of course, we're going to talk about data audit and assurance as well. And in terms of frameworks, we're going to specifically look at the most important one from our point of view in Ireland as an EU member state, and also, you know, for attendees from the UK, which have a similar, you know, will presumably will have a similar framework. We're looking at the new CSRD, the new Corporate Sustainability Reporting Standards Directive that came into force in the EU as of 1st January just passed. So CSRD, which is the new reporting directive, has a key implication for any EU companies, particularly obviously today we're focusing perhaps on those in Ireland, also the UK or elsewhere in the EU. It will also, which I will mention when we come to that, apply to certain non-EU companies in certain circumstances at a later date. But we'll talk about that a little later on in the session. And then finally, we're going to look at an example or a case study of a public body called Transport Infrastructure Ireland to show how all of this works in practice, how all of this is reflected in a good, robust, comprehensive sustainability plan. So I hope all of that makes sense in terms of the agenda we're going to follow today.
Okay. Ian, can I just cut in there real quick? Would you be able to switch to the presenter view? We're
of
seeing
course,
the,
of course.
yeah. Cheers.
Full screen.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Alex. Okay, so having looked at, you know, what we're here to talk about today, the agenda for the day, let's define our terms. Let's look at some key definitions. And really, one of the challenges when we come to look at ESG sustainability the green agenda, if you like, are various acronyms and definitions. So let's start off first of all with ESG itself. I mean, apologies if we're already familiar with this, but I thought it was important at the outset just to spend a couple of minutes just focusing on that we were absolutely clear what we're talking about. ESG, environmental, social, and governance issues that focus on measurement of the organization's sustainability. The first leg of that, the E, pretty clear, environmental. We're talking about things like air pollution, water pollution, biodiversity, all of that. Social, slightly less obvious, is things like human rights, which focuses not just on our own compliance with human rights legislation, like the Modern Slavery Act in the UK in terms of forced labor, but also, you know, what are the people in our value or our supply chain doing in respect of human rights? All that comes under the S, which is the social. And then finally, the governance, which kind of in a wider sense might be taken to include things like corporate governance, you know, board composition, you know, board makeup, board committees, subcommittees, roles and responsibilities at board level. All that is covered by governance. So in ESG, we're focusing on all of those issues that focus on measurement. So sustainability, if we look at the bottom right-hand corner, which is taken from a definition given in a UN report called the Brundtland Report back in 1987, sustainability is about meeting the needs of the present. This is the definition on the bottom right-hand corner. Apologies for skipping on a little, but it's key to tie this into what we mean by ESG, because sustainability meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. So in other words, ESG is kind of almost the how. How do we do this? How do we measure how we're doing in sustainability? So that's how ESG ties in with sustainability. And all of this is part or feeds into the green agenda or the European Green Deal, which we're going to talk about a little later on, because obviously we're focusing on green strategic planning primarily from an EU perspective, but also a global perspective, including obviously our friends in the UK. So having looked at ESG and sustainability, other definitions include carbon footprint, which is the amount of greenhouse gases, including carbon dioxide and methane, that are generated by the organization. Circular economy, sharing, reusing, repairing, and recycling materials and products for as long as possible. Those are kind of basic concepts in terms of what we mean by environmental compliance. And then finally, bottom left-hand corner, climate change. And this is a really important one because this really focuses our attention specifically on the green part of ESG, the environmental aspect. So climate change is the long-term changes in temperatures and weather conditions across the world, focusing on long-term, not the weather today or next week or the forecast for the next month, the long-term. For example, the temperature increases since 1970 have been the greatest single increases in any single 50-year period in the last 2,000 years. So long-term climate change is happening. Now, today is not the day to focus on, is that man-made? Is that natural? We're assuming, the assumption of today is that this is man-made and the science goes that direction, but that's not the focus of today. Today, we're concerned with how do we plan for all of this? We're not concerned so much about the why climate change is happening. We're assuming it's a fact, which the science tells us it is. The focus of today is how do we plan for this? How do we plan for climate change, managing our carbon footprint, the circular economy, ESG, measuring all of this, and more, and fundamentally of all, most fundamental of all, are we sustainable? Do we meet the needs of the present generation, the present business, the present operations, without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their needs? So those are our key definitions, and I just thought we should be clear before we go into more detail about planning for all of this, okay? So, most importantly of all, section 2, the plan. So when we look at the essentials of the plan, we're focusing on two things: the structure of what a plan might look like, and the essentials in terms of the elements of the plan on the next slide. But before we get to that, let's look at a structure. Now, this is quite a busy slide, so we're going to spend a little bit of time teasing out what we mean by all of this, because a lot of assumptions are made about sustainability, about green, ESG, and not all of them are correct. And some of them are grounded in fact, and unfortunately, some of them are grounded in myth and non-fact. So I think it's important to understand that there's a context to all of this. So for example, if we try and put a structure on a plan, we might first of all focus on the context. We might say a few words in our plan about, for example, the SDGs. These are the 17 United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. And these focus on things like the elimination of poverty, the elimination of illiteracy, the elimination of unemployment, lots of stuff to do with pollution, biodiversity. All of that, is kind of the backdrop to all of this. More specifically, and more recently, we have the Paris Climate Agreement of 2015, which in turn has given rise to the European Green Deal, which among other things requires net zero greenhouse gas emissions, or GHG. That's another acronym you're going to come across in this whole area, which focuses on greenhouse gas emissions. And one of the primary objectives of the European Green Deal is to achieve net zero emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, that is, by 2050. So all of this is the backdrop or the context to what we're trying to do here. So a structured plan should take account of all of this and might even recite some of this backdrop in a few lines in respect of each of these elements of the context to why we're doing this. Conference of the Parties, we all know, we've all heard about COP. The most recent COP28 was last year, 2023, held in Dubai, out there in the United Arab Emirates. A lot of controversy about the location of the most recent COP, but that's not the focus of today. So COP28, the most recent conference of the parties, whereby all of the parties attending that, including ourselves here in Ireland, agreed to certain steps to be taken to combat climate change in particular and environmental damage in general. And then finally, from an Irish perspective, we obviously have our own Climate Action Plan 2024 and whatever the equivalent of that is in the UK and other countries. The Climate Action 2024, I wouldn't blame anybody on the call for not having read it, because it goes to, at the last time I checked, it was 449 pages of good stuff. So you're forgiven if you haven't read it. But But really what it does is it calls out specifically, in Ireland at least, that we have aimed to achieve a 51% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2030 and net zero gas emissions by 2050 in tandem with the European Green Deal objectives at an EU level. Now, our own Irish Climate Action Plan, to be honest, calls out the fact that we're behind schedule. We're now 2024. We have until 2030 to achieve a 51% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. And right now we're behind schedule. So just so we know, that may not be unique to Ireland. It may be the case in the UK or other countries, but it's important that we realize there is a plan. This is part of the context. And the final thing I'll say about our own plan is that it has certain sector-specific objectives, agriculture, transport, services, to achieve certain specific reductions in emissions by the stated year. So all of that is the context. Secondly, the objectives. The overall objective, obviously, is sustainable business operations. So in other words, we need to incorporate everything we're talking about here in our business operations. And we're going to talk a little bit about that more specifically a little later when we talk about reporting and how we actually write this down in terms of outcomes. But the overall objective has to be to achieve sustainable business operations. And that includes things like corporate social responsibility. How are we going to achieve that? One of the key methods to achieve that is a robust corporate social responsibility plan within the overall sustainability plan. And what do we mean by CSR? It can be defined as a business model designed to improve society and the natural environment, which is important from our green point of view, including checks and balances, which is what we mean by corporate governance, to ensure a sustainable business. It will also ensure compliance with ESG requirements, because don't forget what we said earlier, ESG is about measurement. Sustainability is about the high level having a business operation that is sustainable, profitable, environmentally friendly. But unless we can measure that, unless we can show compliance with the ESG elements of sustainability, we're going to struggle to convince a regulator, we're going to struggle to convince a supplier, we're going to struggle to convince a major customer. So that's why ESG feeds into all of this. And that's a key part of our objectives, business compliance, as well as being seen to be a good corporate citizen. Okay. Next, strategy, which is a statement of our action plan to achieve long-term sustainability objectives. This could be a sentence or two just to say, this is our strategy. This is how we propose. This is a summary or a description, sentence or two, all that's needed. This is the way we propose to achieve our long-term objectives in terms of sustainability. In other words, to summarize our action plan in a couple of sentences. That's our strategy. Now, we'll have lots of other strategies. We'll have a business strategy, which obviously is to be profitable. But you can be profitable without being sustainable. We have to be sustainable. And that's what we mean by a specific sustainability strategy. Okay. Next section could be the basic definitions we've spoken about. There are one or two definitions here on this slide that we haven't covered yet, which I'll cover later, like double materiality, taxonomy, which we need to talk about later on the heading of reporting. But at the very least, our plan needs to cover the basic definitions to make sure that somebody reading this plan, don't forget, it could be a third party, could be a regulator who's asking himself or herself, you know, are these guys serious about what they're doing? You know, where have they defined what they mean by sustainability? So that needs to be in there. Okay. Next section might be something on methodology. What methods have we determined to achieve our accurate and up-to-date research? Have we engaged? What internal, external stakeholders have we engaged with? Internal, obviously, people like our directors, mainly, most importantly, our employees, our people on the ground, our foot soldiers who are implementing all of this. From an external point of view, our shareholders, our suppliers, a regulator, for example, might be consulted in respect of how we're going about all of that, which is covered by methodology. What opportunities and threats to the business arise from all of this? And finally, how are we going to monitor this? What are our KPIs? How are we going to indicate whether we're performing or not against our plan? And then second from last, risks and controls. Like I said earlier, sustainability planning is part of risk management. It's another risk to be addressed. There's lots of risks, financial risks, legal risks, enterprise risks from the fact that we open our doors every Monday morning. You know, so there are specific sustainability risks we need to identify and put in our plan as well. For example, if we're manufacturing, the risk we're going to pollute the local river beside the factory. if we're a service company, the risk that we're going to engage with a third-party supplier in our value chain who employs forced labor. Like all of these risks arise, and they are specific sustainability risks. And then finally, underpinning all of that, how can we be assured that we're actually doing all of this? And that feeds into how do we report on this, and how do we make sure that our data is of good quality, and to what extent are we assured? Have we a third-party assurance provider like an auditor who will come in and provide assurance that all of our data and that our performance monitoring methods are correct, accurate, robust. So all of those are just how we might structure our plan, depending on obviously the nature of your business, the nature of your operation. Okay, so I hope that gives some overall flavor of how we might structure a plan, because all of this is really important, not just to be seen as a good corporate citizen, but just as importantly from a compliance point of view, whether we operate in a regulated industry or not. This is hugely important. Okay. So having determined what our overall structure is, what are the elements? What are the key 5-6 elements we need to cover to at the risk of trivializing this, to at least be able to say that we've ticked the boxes, that our plan covers the basic elements, as well as all of the other stuff we've spoken about in terms of our structure and why we're doing this. So obviously ESG, the first 3 bullets will cover that. Environmental, have we covered any risk in relation to pollution, biodiversity, climate, energy consumption? What energy are we using? Are we using gas, electricity? How do we monitor all of that? What waste are we generating? All of that is covered by environmental. Secondly, social. What policies have we got on employment rights, labor rights, forced labor, modern slavery, as per the UK Modern Slavery Act, which while it only applies in the UK, obviously, has become kind of the gold standard almost for forced labor legislation worldwide. What about our supply value chain? Have we made inquiries of suppliers to us, or customers, or our customers in respect of what they're doing in terms of their ESG agenda? Community engagement, are we engaged with the local community? Do we make charitable donations? Are we involved in any social responsibility over and above our core objective, which is obviously to make a profit, if we're a business, or if we're a public authority, which is to perform a public function in accordance with whatever legislation covers whatever public authority we work for. And then finally, the G, the governance. What's our code of conduct or ethics? What's our corporate governance look like? How do we deal with risk management? How do we structure our board? What's our committee structure? That's all governance. And then, of course, sustainability. What are our drivers? Sometimes these are referred to our drivers. What drives our sustainability? And these are under various headings: energy, water, waste, facilities or premises, transport, our own employees, and of course, community. All of these things drive our sustainability and must be covered in wherever we decide to cover this in our structure that we spoke about a moment ago. And then second from last, what are our KPIs? Have we covered these specific KPIs in our overall structure of the plan? What's our baseline? In other words, where are we now? Do you know where you are now? How do you know where you are? How do you know what your greenhouse gas emissions are? How do you know what energy you consume? How do you know what waste you generate? What's your baseline? And what are your metrics to monitor performance over time, over whatever period of time, 5, 10, 15 years, to monitor the achievement of a satisfactory and compliant sustainability performance against your baseline, against the metrics that you've set? How are you going to monitor this? How are you going to report it? What framework are we going to use? Now, we're going to talk about a little bit about frameworks in just a moment when we come to look at reporting. From an EU perspective, primarily, we're talking about the CSRD, which I mentioned earlier, and we'll talk about that in just a moment. But how do we monitor? How do we report on all of this? And that's an absolutely key element of our reporting framework. And then finally, I guess maybe most importantly, none of this is going to get done unless somebody does it. So who does what? Roles and responsibilities. Board responsibilities, senior management, sustainability champions. Sorry, beg your pardon. Board responsibilities, boards, CEO, CFO, chief commercial officer, if there is such a person, chief risk officer, all the people at board stroke senior management level. What are their responsibilities in all of this? Our senior management, some of those managers may not be on the board. What are the managers doing about all of this? And really important from a day-to-day compliance point of view, do we have sustainability champions? Do we have people on the factory floor, on the office floor, actually championing all of this? In other words, within each team in the business, is there somebody who has bought into this, is aware of what we need to do, and more importantly, is aware of why we're doing it? Is there somebody that we can point to say, team A, down on the factory floor, is all over this and is challenging his or her colleagues to make sure we're actually doing all of this. Not only is his or her name on a sheet, and it may be part of his or her job, but are they doing it, and are their colleagues doing it? And that's absolutely key, to have a champion in the business. The board, senior management can dictate policies and set out strategies and have a plan, but if it's not been put into place down on the factory floor or the office floor or at home, if people are working remotely, none of this makes sense. None of this is going to work. So sustainability champions, I think, is something you really need to cover in your plan, wherever you decide to put it in terms of the structure we spoke about a moment ago. Okay. So having looked at kind of a structure you might adopt, having looked at the essentials of to make sure that all of that is incorporated in whatever way you decide to incorporate it in your plan, we need to see section 3, how all of that feeds into sustainability, compliance, and reporting. So to take compliance first, we look at reporting in just a moment, but kind of to take compliance first. Like I mentioned earlier, there are various EU and global reporting frameworks. I've mentioned some of them there on the slide. You may be familiar with some of these already. GRI, the Global Reporting Initiative, the International Integrated Reporting Framework, which is provided by a body called the SASB, or the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board. There's also another framework called the CDP, the Carbon Disclosure Project. So all of those are frameworks you might look at, or you may already have looked at, depending on how far down the road you are in your sustainability journey in terms of your planning. But I suppose, again, looking at it from primarily, I suppose, because we are looking at this primarily from an EU perspective, primarily we're talking about, most importantly, we're looking at the CSRD, the EU Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, came into force, like I said earlier, on the 1st of January. I'll be looking on the next slide when it comes to reporting specifically. I'll look into a little bit more detail in relation to that. But this is what's driving our sustainability compliance, because we can't report on something unless we're satisfied we actually comply with it. And we can't comply with something unless we know what are we expected to report on, whether we're in scope of this new directive or not, because it only applies to certain companies. But regardless of whether we're technically in scope of something like this new EU directive, we need to know what's expected of us. What if a major customer asks us for our sustainability plan? What standards are we reporting against? What standards are we saying we're compliant with? Or it could be a customer, it could be a supplier, a major supplier to us, could say, what standards are you reporting against? Is it the CSRD, which is the latest EU directive, or is it against some global reporting framework like GRI? So these are questions we're going to need to be able to answer from a business point of view, not just from a compliance or a regulatory point of view, but from a business point of view. How have you integrated all of these requirements into your business operations? And that's where we're trying to get to in terms of compliance, not just a narrow legal regulatory compliance, but compliance with whatever framework you've decided you're going to adopt to measure against, assuming, let's say, you're either a non-EU company or you're of a size where you fall below the threshold that needs to comply with the latest EU Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. So we're trying to take a broad view in terms of compliance. We look at reporting in just a moment, but right now we're talking about compliance. So just on this slide, just to say a word about what's called taxonomy. You may have heard this term. It almost sounds like something to do with I don't know, butterflies or classifying species of wildlife, but it's not. In this case, it is a form of classification, but what it is it's a cornerstone of the EU's sustainable finance framework. So primarily it's directed at investors to be able to say that this particular company or sector we're proposing to invest in complies with the EU taxonomy regulations. In other words, that it complies with the EU's environmental objectives. Those objectives are set out, like I said earlier, the primary one, which is net greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. Those objectives are set out in the European Green Deal, which I'm sure we're all familiar with. So taxonomy is a classification system that defines criteria for economic activities that are aligned with these objectives. It protects investors from what's called greenwashing. You may have heard of this term, whereby companies pretend to be green or at least greener than they are. So an investor or a potential investor can look at the activities of the company and make an inquiry as to whether and measure the activities of that or the operations of that company against specific standards laid out in the 2020 taxonomy regulation, so that investor can make an informed decision as to whether that company has achieved a standard of green or sustainability compliance, which makes it worthwhile to invest in. And that's all set out in the taxonomy regulation. Now, that's more in the reporting area than in the planning area. We could spend an entire session just talking about taxonomy, but that's not the purpose of today. We're here to talk about planning, but it's important to be aware that in your planning, your plan may be reviewed by an investor. It may not just be reviewed by a regulator or a customer or a supplier. It may be an investor or a potential investor in your business may want to see, well, what are you guys up to? What are your operations? What are your activities? How have you identified specific, for example, sustainability risks and controls to tell me that you're a company worth investing in? And that's where taxonomy comes into play. So I just thought it worth mentioning that as part of this session. And then finally on this slide, data audit stroke assurance. This is to ensure sustainability reporting to comply with EU stroke global requirements, which is essentially about quality assurance of the data reporting. Now, you may decide you don't have the expertise or the capacity internally to do this. Many companies will outsource or will engage a third party to provide the necessary assurance in respect of two key areas. First of all, how robust is our data? How do we know what our baseline is? How do we know what our emissions are? How do we know what waste we're generating? So in other words, what's the quality of our data? And secondly, what's the quality on an ongoing basis of our performance monitoring against our self-determined KPI metrics? In other words, the data is fine, but how are we performing against the metrics we decided earlier in our plan? How are we measuring performance against those KPIs so we can report our current position? Satisfactory, excellent, unsatisfactory, poor, whatever. So data audit assurance is key, and that may need, and many companies will not have the expertise or the capacity to do that themselves. That may require third-party input in respect of audit or insurance. And that's particularly relevant when it comes to reporting and standards, which we're going to look at now on the next slide. So I hope that gives some idea of where we're coming from a compliance point of view, framework, standards, bearing taxonomy or classification in mind. And then how do we assure ourselves that all of this is true? Okay. So then coming towards the end, then just to look at reporting before we look at our I think we have time. Yeah, before we look at a little bit more reporting, CSRD, and then we had a look at our case study. So have we looked at compliance? So let's just say a few words about reporting. How does all of this feed into reporting, and how does reporting affect how we approach compliance? Because the two are absolutely closely interrelated and tied in together. So in terms of reporting, the first thing to say is, like I said earlier, not everyone on this call, not every attendee will be employed or be associated or work for an organization that is in scope of the new requirements. These are the new CSRD requirements, which are the specific EU requirements that came into force in January. But regardless of that, the advantage they have is that they focus on how we integrate all of the sustainability requirements into our business operations. So even if from a compliance point of view, we may or may not be technically required to comply with the new standards, and we look about that in just a moment on the next slide to see who is in scope. But even if you're not technically in scope, the beauty and the value of the reporting requirements is it acts as a focus on what are the things we should be looking at, what are the things we may be asked to report on, not necessarily by a regulator, but by a supplier or a major customer. So what has to be reported, and I won't go through this line by line, it's all there set out on the slide. But if we look at what has to be reported, first of all, we should have a brief description of the company's business model and strategy, including resilience of the strategy in relation to sustainability, opportunities opportunities for the company that may arise from sustainability. Don't forget, this gives rise to opportunities. It's not all threats. It's not all downside. There may be business opportunities here. So we should include all of that in a brief description of the company's business model and strategy. Okay. Secondly, we give a description of the time-bound targets for sustainability matters set by the company. So in other words, what are we going to achieve specifically and when in relation to sustainability? And this is all set out in great detail in the CSRD. So these are things we need to think about, take advice on, consult with, and so on, whether internally or externally. Okay. Just conscious of time, we'll just move quickly through the remaining requirements of sustainability reporting under the new EU directive. A description of the role of the company's administrative, management, and supervisory bodies, primarily, obviously, the board of directors, but also the senior management team, or if there's any other forum within the company that has a defined role in relation to sustainability. For example, there may be a group of sustainability champions, like we mentioned earlier, who meet on a weekly, monthly, periodic basis. That may be a recognized body for these purposes. Pardon me. Description of the company's policies, what policies, what documents have we in place in relation to all of this. We should have those to hand, available for inspection, and they should be kept up to date and reviewed and signed off. Information about any incentive schemes. Do we have a bonus scheme linked to achievement of sustainability objectives? Is there a share options? Are they linked to any achievement in relation to sustainability? And so on. Pardon me. Description of due diligence, the environmental impact and any actions taken by the company to deal with actual or potential adverse impacts on the environment. So in other words, what due diligence have we taken in respect of all of this? We should describe that in our sustainability report. Second from last, description of principal risks to the company. We should have identified all of these in our planning. Isn't that right? When we talked about identifying risks and controls as one of the key elements in our plan. Because like I said at the beginning of our session, this is all part of risk management. It's another risk to the business. In the same way as legal risk, the risk of being sued, or financial risk, the risk that we won't make a profit. We have specific sustainability risks, the risk that we will cause damage to the environment. Whatever. And then finally, indicators, the KPIs. Indicators relevant to the matters referred to above. Now, all of these are taken from the directive. These aren't ideas of mine or other consultants in respect of what you should do or what would be good to do. These are legal compliance requirements arising from the EU directive that came into force on 1st January. So what KPIs, we spoke about these earlier as well. So what indicators have we in place that are relevant to the various matters we referred to, which is everything, which is not good news, I know, but we should have key metrics or key performance indicators to show how well are we doing under E, under S, under G, under sustainability in general, and so on. Okay. So, and then finally, under compliance and reporting, before we come to look at our case study, conscious that we're I think we're at 1:40 now, so we're just coming up to the time. So just very quickly, again, this will only apply to those of us on the call who are, those companies, organizations who are within scope of the CSRD. This is the latest directive. It's directly applicable to Irish companies and other EU companies as well. New EU requirements for sustainable reporting came into place, which we've spoken about. These requirements apply to approximately 50,000 companies throughout the EU. Companies must report on their sustainability efforts and impacts in their annual financial statements. Now, the CRD specifically applies to 2 or 3 specific types of companies. First of all what are called large companies incorporated in the EU and subsidiaries. And a large company is a company that has net turnover more than 40 million, total assets greater than 20 million, and more than 250 employees. 2 of those 3 criteria must be met to be regarded as a large company. So in other words, generally it's large companies that meet at least two of those three criteria are in scope. But there are two other categories as well. Parent companies incorporated in the EU, where the group of companies collectively meet the above criteria. And thirdly, smaller companies or SMEs, provided they're listed on an EU regulated market. And that brings into play a much wider subset of companies than would otherwise come under the heading of large companies. So at the last estimate, there are roughly around 50,000 companies. I'm not sure quite how many in Ireland specifically, but there certainly are around 50,000 companies in the EU that are captured by these requirements. Now, later on down the tracks, the EU announced recently that they have delayed implementation of these requirements for non-EU companies, that is, companies that are incorporated outside the EU, even though they may have business operations in Ireland. So right now, these new requirements are being implemented between now and 2028. These specific requirements for certain, like I said a moment ago, certain non-EU companies have been delayed until a later date. So we don't yet know right now when certain non-EU companies, i.e. companies with a business in an EU member state, but headquartered outside, we don't yet know when all of these requirements will apply in full to those companies in terms of sustainability reporting. But all of the companies listed on the screen before you are in scope currently of the Sustainability Reporting Directive on a staggered basis between now and 2028. So now is the time to start thinking, maybe not the current financial year, depending on when your financial year is. Not all companies have a financial year which is the same as calendar year, but now is the time to start thinking, how do we comply with the new reporting directive? Now, to do that, this isn't just about reporting, this is about planning. How do we plan? And on the basis of our plan, how are we going to report all of this? We can't comply with this reporting directive, and we can't report on anything unless we have a plan. So planning is key and feeds into reporting. They're two sides of the same coin. So it's absolutely key we get our planning before we dive into the detail around reporting, which is only now beginning to come into place over a staggered basis over the next 4 years. So, I mean, we could spend the whole morning or the whole session rather today talking about reporting, but that's not the focus. The focus is on planning. But I just wanted to mention and say a little bit about reporting because planning feeds into it. And you start with planning. Reporting can come a little later. So then finally, and I know we've gone through this, and I know this is a lot to take in 45 minutes, but just to say, just to look at how does all of this work in practice. So I've taken there's a public authority in Ireland called Transport and Infrastructure Ireland. So just to call up, and I hope the link works, just to call up and look at this is and I'm just going to focus on the principles here because this is quite a good sustainability implementation plan drawn up by, this is the public authority in Ireland with overall responsibility for transport, rail, road, and so on. So I thought this would be worth a look at, primarily, not so much the detail of their business because they're in the transport business, but primarily from a point of view of, for example, if we look at there's a nice foreword there from the chief executive, which I'm sure we'd all love to read if we had the time, and a nice introduction. But they talk about, this is their sustainability statement. This is kind of essentially is their strategy. Remember we talked earlier about a key element or a key part of your structure of your plan is your statement. In other words, what's your strategy? What are your corporate activities? On the left-hand side, what are your corporate activities? On the right-hand side, how does your corporate sustainability feed into those activities? And what statement, like on this one slide, can you put together to show what your strategy is? And this is a good example of the type of sustainability strategy you need to put in place as a key part of your plan. Nice words there about backgrounds, definitions you might want to include, like we said earlier, your basic definitions, what we mean about sustainability, background. Now I want to focus on these because these are the way the TII has done it is they have these sustainability principles. Now,
sorry, Ian, can I cut you off for 1 second? I know we're short in time and I hate to do this, but we actually can't see the PDF you're talking about. Would you be able to share that? Yeah, it opened up in a new tab. So if you wouldn't mind. It's very interesting, but it'd be great to have the visuals to go alongside it, Cheers.
So would I do a new share?
Yeah. You can share the screen again afterwards for the slides. Perfect. We can see it now.
Great. Thanks, Alex. Thanks. Can everyone
Yeah.
see? Can everyone see the screen there?
They
Is that
should be,
okay,
yeah,
Alex?
yeah. I'm getting messages. We are. Perfect.
Great. Thanks very much. So apologies, guys. So what I was saying, so just to briefly, and again, conscious of time, this is our TII, Sustainability Implementation Plan, introduction forward. There's our strategy. You might want to, obviously this is sector specific to transport, but this is a good indication of corporate activities on the left, sustainability on the right. How does each feed into the other? Don't forget, what we're trying to achieve here is integrating our sustainability strategy into our operations. So however you choose to do that, but visually, this is a good indication of how one feeds into the other, because that's what we're trying to achieve. Okay, a little bit of background, more on background. Yeah, and these are the principles like I was speaking about a moment ago. You may call these objectives or you may call the principles. The way the TII has structured this, they have 5 or 6 key principles, which I think are very useful because they guide what comes later in the plan. They talk about, for example, leadership, collaboration, partnership, working together on enabling people, collaborating for a holistic approach, delivering end-to-end improvements, transition to net zero, and then at the end, there's another principle there, which I can't read on the screen because Alex's very handsome profile, handsome face is covering the right-hand side of my screen, but no worries.
They can see me, don't I?
Thanks, Alex. So you might structure it this way, having your principles set out, and then each page after that, and you may think this is a little bit long. You may tailor it to your specific requirements. There's a lot of detail and text in respect of what do they mean about these principles? What do they mean about safe and resilient networks and services and holistic approach and end-to-end improvements? And most importantly of all, I guess, transition to net zero. What do they mean by that, and how do they propose to achieve that? And finally, how do they propose to create total value for society? Which again goes to the S part of the ESG, which is about social. So in other words, they're focusing not just on the green, but they're focusing on the social as well. CSR, corporate social responsibility, it's all related. And I hope I've given you some indication of how sustainability feeds into corporate social responsibility and into ESG, not just the E part, which is the specifically green part, which is, I suppose, from an environmental point of view, the most urgent, because the planet is burning, the planet is on fire, but also the S and the G, the social part, which is they're referencing here, value for society. And then finally, the governance part, the how. How are we going to do all of this? What's our corporate governance? What's our board of directors doing about this? Who's responsible for what? How do we set out roles and responsibilities, and so on? And they also have 2 overarching responsibilities, which to me is slightly overkill, slightly confusing, because they then go on to talk about 2 overarching principles called leadership, collaboration, and working together, which to me are captured by their original principles. But finally, just on this case study, they have a very useful diagram where they point out all the principles they've spoken about going into the funnel, and then inputting into that are the activities and actions. Research, we spoke about that, methodology research, operations and project delivery, education, upskilling, which is all about training. We haven't mentioned training. All of this is key as well. New and updated standards, the ESRS, which have been put in place by the new CSRD, by the new corporate sustainability reporting directive. There are new standards, specific standards in place, which feed into this as well. Sustainability procurement and supply chain, which is all about our third parties. Project appraisal, strategic planning, setting targets. All of those activities and actions feed in and play a part in connecting our lovely, lofty principles into outcomes for the business. And those specific outcomes are called out. Effective partnership, sustainable procurement, environmental enhancement, asset management. Because don't forget, a company like TII, Transport Infrastructure Ireland, will own lots of assets. The rail network, the bus network, those are all tangible physical assets that need managing. Sustainability feeds into all of that. So in other words, it's important that we tie in principles to outcomes. In other words, which is a fancy way, I guess, of saying it's important we tie in sustainability to our business operations. And then finally, they set out a timeline. May or may not be your timeline. You may decide to divide this in a different way. They've divided it into specific outcomes over 1 to 2 years, 3 to 5 years, 6 to 10 years plus. So your plan should have some kind of a timeline to indicate, when do we plan to achieve all of this, as well as who's going to do it in terms of responsibilities, roles, responsibilities. And then finally, what does success look like? What are the outcomes? And this is all based on our KPIs. How do we measure performance? How will we know that we've achieved the objectives in our sustainability plan? So there's a structure there you might choose to use. The text will change depending on the nature of your business or your operations. But I think that's a pretty good structure, and visually I like the way they presented it as well. And then measuring progress, which you spoke about, next steps, which brings us on to, and I'll just stop that share and go into our own share, because we're going to finish up now by talking about, here we can see this. We're back to my screens now.
Perfect. Yeah, you amazing. Thanks, Ian.
Okay, so having looked at the case study example principles, so, you know, and I know this is a lot to take in, but having looked at, you know, in terms of the plan, the structure, the essentials, how it ties into reporting and looking at a good case study of what we mean by a good sustainability plan, you know, what are the ways forward? You know, where are we going with all of this? What does all this mean to you? So first of all, we need to look, when we're coming to look at a plan, look at your structure. And you're seeking to answer three questions here: why, what, and how. Why are we doing this? That's all should be set out in your background or your context and your strategy. Why are you doing this? What are you trying to do? That's set out in your definitions, your principles if you take the TII model, or your objectives if you decide to set them out as objectives rather than principles. Your methodology, which is the how, sustainability risks and controls, which is part of risk management, and then finally data audit and assurance, which we spoke about at length earlier. So get your structure right, which is answering why are we doing this, what are we doing, how are we going to do it, and all of those items on the right hand side of the screen answer each of those three questions. Second thing is the elements, to make sure we tick all the boxes, and that having arrived at a structure, what are the elements? What are the ESG elements? What are our drivers? What are our KPIs? What about reporting? What about roles and responsibilities? Who's doing what? And are there any specific initiatives we plan to take? And we haven't spoken enough about that. For example, what specific initiatives, you know, is there anything that, you know, one of our sustainability champions, for example, may have come up with a particular initiative to, you know, reduce energy consumption by low energy light bulbs throughout the building, or insulating, you know, a particular facility or premises where we operate from, and so on. So what are there any specific initiatives we can point to as part of our plan? That may be an element of our plan that we should capture as well. And then finally, we should bear in mind, where does all of this fit into our compliance, not just legal and regulatory compliance, but our compliance with our own plan? That's compliance as well. And secondly, how does it fit into reporting? How are we going to incorporate all of these, our structure of our plan, our elements of our plan? How are we going to report on all of this to a regulator if we're in a regulated industry, or from a business point of view, how are we going to report all of this? How are we going to explain or report all of this to a major customer or a major supplier? Now, from an EU point of view, obviously, we're concerned about the CSRD, but it may be we're not captured by CSRD because we're outside the EU. Let's say we're based in the UK, or we're inside the EU, but we're not a large company, in which case we're not captured by CSRD. We may decide we're not going to comply with CSRD, but we are going to apply with, you know, for example, GRI, which is the Global Reporting Initiative, which is one of those frameworks we spoke about earlier. So if that's the case, how do we show on inquiry from a third party how we comply with that framework, whether it's the EU directive or some other framework that we choose to comply with? And then finally, very finally, and I know we've run over time, just very finally to say a few words about something which the CSRD specifically requires, and I suggest that you might want to have a look at these, and that is the what I call the ESRS, the European Sustainability Reporting Standards, which were issued on foot of an EU regulation in July last year. In July 2023, the EU issued a 300-page document setting out the specific standards that must be met by companies who are in scope of the new directive, i.e. the CSRD. Now, these are standards, you know, we don't have time to come into them here. We could spend a day, a week talking about these new standards, highly technical. Some of them apply Some of them are sector specific. Some of them are what's called cross-cut. They cut across different sectors, and some of them are what's called topical. Topical is a fancy word for ESG. In other words, they're actually focused specifically on ESG requirements. So you may want to look at ESRS, which is, to repeat, is the European Sustainability Reporting Standards, which are specifically, and these are law, these aren't nice to have, these are must have, and they're set out in an EU regulation of July 2023. And the CSRD effectively calls these out as the standards that companies in scope of CSRD must comply with. So the focus today is not so much on that, it's on planning. But again, you need to bear in mind, in terms of drawing up your plan, that you may be obliged to report on all of these things at a later date. So Alex, I over to you. Thanks everybody for your time. I'm sorry we've run over time. Happy to stay on, answer questions, deal with any queries. And again, thank you for your attendance. I know it's lunchtime and it's a tough ask to stay alert and pay attention to all of this. So those of you who are still awake, thank you for that, and happy to take any questions. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much for that, Ken. We really appreciate you coming on. A lot of interesting things covered today, so a lot of food for thought for some people listening to this, I'm sure. We've got a question here from a Jason from a little while ago earlier, and more specifically about the CSRD. So maybe you can illuminate this here. Does the CSRD apply to cooperatives too? They have a different entity status than other companies.
Yes, it applies. It can apply to cooperatives. It's not strictly limited to what we might call limited companies. There are certain unlimited companies and companies incorporated under different regimes that it may apply to. It's primarily driven by turnover and number of employees rather than the specific nature of the corporate entity. But so in principle, co-ops are covered. I just need to check. I don't have the 200 pages of the CSRD in front of me right now, but in principle, there's no reason why a co-op is not covered by the CSRD.
Perfect. All right, then we're obviously a little bit ahead, so we're going to wait, give people some time to type in some questions. There was one thing that was actually on my mind. It was like, what are the common pitfalls or challenges that businesses are encountering when developing their plan? Because a lot of companies haven't done this before. So is there any
Sure.
red flag warnings you need to keep an eye out for?
Sure. Yeah. The pitfalls. That's a really good question, because the pitfalls are two pitfalls. Namely, some people think they don't need a plan and they can just wing it. In terms of, and by that I'm, without being facetious, what I mean by that is that some companies may take the view, well, we deal with it if we get an inquiry or we get a complaint, or we wait until a supplier or a customer makes an inquiry. Well, that's not in the kind of the new regulatory environment. That's not really kind of a satisfactory approach. This needs to be planned for, if not from a narrow legal regulatory point of view, but also from a commercial business point of view, that our customers and our suppliers will expect us to comply with all of this. This is no longer a nice to have, it's effectively become a must have. So the first pitfall is failure to plan. And the second thing is that the plan doesn't have the right structure. In other words, it doesn't call out, what sector are we in? What business are we in? That the plan goes straight into, we're going to comply with this, and this. Well, which is good, but this may not apply to that company, because the company is not in a sector that's subject to compliance, or the company may not be of a size. It may be a small company, in which case it may not be technically covered by CSRD or some other reporting framework at all. So the key pitfalls are failure to plan, and as our famous sporting icon here in Ireland, Roy Keane, said, what did he say? Failure to plan, is it planned to failure? So therefore, you must plan to avoid failure. So put a plan in place, but secondly, make sure it captures what it needs to capture. The most important thing is why. Why does this apply to us? Secondly, what are we going to do about it? And thirdly, how are we going to do all of that? What's our methodology? What are the roles and responsibilities? Who does what? And if we structure it in that way, we'll avoid the pitfalls.
Right, it's very interesting, Ian. Well said. I've another one here for you as well. I'm a bit curious. Is like, well, again, this is obviously a new area for a lot of companies that haven't much experience in this. Like, is there any, tangible benefits that you have talked to other companies about that you can talk about, or any return on investments, anything like that, that would just show that this isn't just, regulatory
Yeah,
requirements. There are actually benefits.
absolutely. Yeah, yeah, completely, Alex. One of the key benefits, which we haven't even touched on because we've been focusing on detail and technicalities and legal, regulatory, and all of that, and business as well. But one of the big benefits is from a reputational point of view. This is about being seen, not just being a good corporate citizen, but being seen to be a good corporate citizen, being seen as best in class, above board, corporate excellence. This is about, and the key benefits of that are not just being seen as a goody two shoes and as a corporate angel, but also being seen, it has specific benefits in terms of attracting customers, attracting employees, retaining employees you want to retain, and all those key benefits that come from continuity, that come from low staff turnover, that come from morale among employees, that come from people wanting to work for your business, customers wanting to do business with your business, suppliers wanting to supply to your business. All of these are the direct, tangible benefits that come from a reputation as being seen as a good corporate citizen and complying with all of these requirements.
No, you're so right. You're so right. Like, I am one of that new generation coming up that changed careers to be into a more sustainable one after that. So, you're absolutely spot on. There mightn't be the full breadth of evidence yet, but there's definitely the reality that that is the way we're going. But listen, Ian, we've only gone over time by 25 minutes, so we've done very well. That's the nature of the topic. We can talk about this for hours, as you said many times throughout. So I want to thank you again so much for taking your time out of the day to speak to everyone here. And I want to thank everyone listening to have attended, and hopefully you gathered something useful out of this. And for all those that have not yet signed on to the diploma, we've got a start date on the 20th. So next week, there's still time to sign up, and hopefully we can all start in our plan together. So thank you so much, and thank you.
Thanks, Alex. Yeah, thanks, Alex, and thanks everyone for staying with this. Thank you.
Perfect. Cheers, Ian. Thank you so much. Catch
Bye-bye.
you all soon.
Bye-bye.